Here's Anne McElvoy to start the week.
The one feminist book I recall my mother reading when I was a teenager was Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. It railed against enforced housewifery, Freud and penis envy, and the domestic stereotypes being peddled by advertisers and women's magazines. Well, 50 years after this mighty j'accuse, today's feminism has different quandaries. For all the progress women have made in the workplace, for instance, a clutch of recent news stories suggests that unwelcome sexual advances can still mar women's careers. And when we're encouraged to grab a quick Botox to hold back the years, where does the quest for ageless beauty leave the aspiration of feminist thinkers like Mary Wollstonecraft in the 18th century that women should flee the gilded cage of mere lookism? Four very different female voices join me round the table this morning to probe the paradoxes of today's feminism. And afterwards on Woman's Hour, you can join the conversation by calling 03700 100 444 to talk about what feminism means to you. With me now are the writer Natasha Walter, author of Living Dolls and the New Feminism, Catherine Hakim, an academic who suggested that women should deploy their erotic capital to make the best of their life chances, Shireen El-Feki, who's just published Sex and the Citadel, delving into the private lives of women in the Arab world, and Finn Mackay, a campaigner who's organised events like the Reclaim the Night marches. Finn supports a degree of proud feminist separatism. Natasha, coming to you first, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique was a very specific cry of rage about the way intelligent women were being kept out of the mainstream of professional life in America. I'm thinking of Betty Draper in Mad Men here.
Absolutely.
What does Friedan have to say to women now?
I think it's interesting that she still does have quite a lot to say to women today. I mean, there is a lot in her book that now just sounds like common sense. It's the sort of thing that we take for granted, I think, often now. And I think that is down to the success of feminism over the last 50 years, that, that messages that once might have sounded very radical now sound simply mainstream, simply common sense. This idea that women will often want more than just to be a mother and a housewife, that women will want to be fulfilled in the workplace. We often take that for granted. But I think there are definitely still struggles for feminism today. And I think we have to listen to some of the voices, the radical voices pressing for change at the moment. And imagine, in 50 years' time, I think that a lot of those voices will also sound simply like mainstream common sense.
Well, it's interesting that you emphasise things that we take for granted now, which seemed quite out there in 1963. But she was a campaigner and she was a bit given to hyperbole. And I've struck reading the book by her saying that people were growing up wanting to be just a housewife. Women were in just as much danger if they did that than if they were being sent to a concentration camp, which is some quite bizarre thing.
Well, I think, it's often the case that a radical voice might, need to really press forward the point that she's making in order to get people to listen. And of course, she was seen as a radical and often marginal voice for a long time. But gradually, it's interesting how the rest of society and more mainstream voices caught up with her. And that's often a pattern you see in feminism. Feminism is, let's not forget, an incredibly successful movement. If you look back at the history of feminism and the gains that it has won, if we look at the lives of women in the UK, it is extraordinary how they've been transformed. But I think we shouldn't lose sight of the urgency of the changes that still have to happen. I mean, in my recent book, Living Dolls, what I wanted to map was the pressures that the hypersexual culture that we live in still put on young women. And that hypersexual culture is often seen as empowering, even liberating for young women. But I also wanted to show that it can be very difficult for young women to negotiate.
We will come back to that theme and to sex later on. But Shireen, you grew up in Canada, but you do have roots in Egypt. How far does Friedan's book echo with someone coming at this with a cultural background that is wider than just the West?
To my knowledge, The Feminine Mystique has not yet been translated into Arabic. And to listeners, if anyone is aware of an Arabic translation, please send a message on my website, sexandthecitadel.com, because I would like to know, and quite frankly, I think millions of women across the Arab world would benefit from reading it. The central message that women should be happy, satisfied with marriage and motherhood and the home, it resonates with millions of women across the Arab region. We may not have a feminine mystique, but we have an Islamist mystique now in the region. And that conceptualization of a woman's role is essentially harkening back to traditional quote-unquote Arab and Islamic values that a woman's place first and foremost is as a wife and a mother. They may or may not pay lip service to the fact that women can work, they should have political engagement, but it's lip service often at best.
What is that like for you when you were in Egypt? Do you feel that you shared some of the kind of professional, the tick in the box that professional women get in the West, and that you're expected to be something else?
Well, it's very interesting that I spent 5 years traveling across the Arab world talking to people about sex. And sexual rights are integral to the outcomes that the feminist movement is looking for. And yet, of the more than 100 people I spoke to, housewives, working women, religious leaders, activists, bloggers, all of those, feminism only came up twice in conversation. And so, although the goals of feminism are certainly crucial and desired by millions of women in the Arab region, the means to that end through a feminist movement has not really taken hold as yet for most women in the region.
Catherine Hakim, the choices for women going into work now have improved massively since Friedan wrote her book. So is Women at Work actually a success story? Maybe we've won the battle that she led and can just sit back and enjoy the day job?
Yes, I think so. I mean, things have changed to such an extent that I think books like that are completely irrelevant. But also, in addition, I actually think that books that predated hers, Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, was a far more important book, far more broad in its perspective and far more powerful because it was very thoughtful and not so campaigning. But I think feminism is still very much alive today in the sense of women today feeling they have a place in public life, have rights, have a voice. But as a social movement, I think feminism is dead now, despite the best efforts of people like Kat Banyard and Finn Mackay, who's here today. And I think this is largely because legislation and equal opportunities policies have achieved their goals of creating a level playing field and fair competition and eliminating the pay gap to something that's quite trivial now. And the problem area that now remains, in my view, is
Do you mean that this is very quickly on the pay gap? Do you mean that it is trivial in terms of amounts, or you mean it's a relatively trivial issue?
It's a very small amount in the sense that it's below 10% on the latest survey data, and it's trivial in the sense that sex discrimination is no longer in any way a key or important part of the explanation for the existence of a pay gap. It's one of the statistics that is most widely quoted and yet is most totally misunderstood. And I think that the key issues now are not in public life and the workplace, which I think we have more or less sorted out through legislation and through equal opportunities policies, a fair playing field. But the key issues now are for private relationships. And in my last two books, one on erotic capital, but the other one on internet dating and playfares, looks at private relationships. And in Honey Money and in the new rules, I show that even when women have an advantage over men, they often fail to see it and fail to use it.
We're going to come back to erotic capital a little later. Finn Mackay, looking rather lively, sitting at the table, not at all dead, but is there some truth there that feminism is a sort of waning attraction as an idea?
Quite the opposite. I think that was a narrative that was alive throughout the 1990s in particular, but it's broadly accepted that since the early 2000s there has been a resurgence of feminism and feminist activism across the UK, and a resurgence of visible feminist activism back on the streets again in a movement largely led by young women. 2010 alone saw around 5 books published on contemporary British feminism. There are over 80 new feminist groups. Reclaim the Night marches are happening again in towns and cities across the country. Something is afoot. Feminism has come back, and I think that is a good news story.
We're talking here just at the moment about work, and one of the signs of that, perhaps, of things like the big push for women on boards and making subjects like that part of the public debate to a greater degree. Is that the right way to go, or is it just pandering to career ambitions of a few ambitious women?
Well, I think most women have career ambitions and they have an outlook of how they want their life to be. And I think that some of the issues that were in Betty Friedan's book are still very live issues around contraception and abortion, for example. We have religious fundamentalists campaigning outside abortion clinics and contraception offices, trying to put women off and make them feel shamed and guilty about their choices. Those sort of things are still live issues. Childcare is still very expensive. I think women still struggle to find a way to have a family and a career, and they know that they can do that and that the right to do that is there, but that doesn't mean that it's easy. And I think there are still difficulties. Equal pay is a massive issue. The idea that you can be paid less than a male colleague for equal work simply because of your sex is an absolute outrage and is an indication of inequality in this country and everywhere else that the pay gap remains.
I think we have to recognise that equal pay for the same job has been eliminated an awful long time ago. The pay gap, which is often misunderstood...
You mean unequal pay for the same job?
Unequal pay for the same job. The pay gap is not about being paid differently for the same job. It's about overall averages for all women working compared to the average for all men working.
I want to take you all away from the workplace now, if I could, and towards the home front and sex life, which have long been battlegrounds in the feminist wars. Natasha, when you wrote The New Feminism, it was about political, social and financial issues. But in your last book, with Living Dolls, you took a very different direction. You focused a lot, as you mentioned earlier, on the impact of a sexualised culture. Why this shift towards fretting about sex?
Well, when I wrote The New Feminism, I was very optimistic. I think I shared maybe some of Catherine Hakim's views, that I was very optimistic that a lot of the work had been done, that, many of the arguments had been won, and it was simply the case that women could go forward and put these arguments into practice. I think then the years passed, and I thought, well, where is this equality that I thought was just there? Why are there still, as you say, so few women on the board, so few women in Parliament, and so few men pulling their weight at home, really, because I think we have to bring that into the equation as well. And my feeling was that there was still a lot of work to be done on people's attitudes, expectations, the sort of sexism that is often unconscious, the assumptions that are socialised into us. And I wanted to look at that and at the pressures, as you say, of the hypersexual culture, which so often seems to be encouraging young women to believe that they've kind of failed in life if they aren't living up to this very narrow image of what it is to be sexually attractive. Whereas Betty Friedan was looking at a sort of hyper-feminine ideal, the woman feeling she'd failed if she wasn't the perfect wife and mother. Now I think we have a different ideal that's also very restrictive to young women, that you've failed if you haven't moulded yourself to this very, very sexy image. And, before we go further, I just want to say this isn't some kind of anti-sex message at all. I think feminism is often unfairly caricatured, that if we are talking about the problems that the mainstreaming of pornography has, or the growing acceptability of sex work and so on, if we're talking about the problems that throws up, that isn't about saying that we don't believe that women shouldn't have liberated, emancipated sex lives. On the contrary, we want young women to be able to live their sex lives freer of those pressures.
Catherine Hakim, is it anti-sex?
Yes, absolutely. What's interesting is in the reaction to my book on erotic capital is that in the Anglo-Saxon countries, UK and USA, there's been this totally negative, hysterical, particularly from women, reaction. Totally negative, this is about sex, about sexuality, about women investing in erotic capital, which is rubbish. I point out in the book that men make more money from being attractive than women do, and that's why women should...
You might just have to tell us what erotic capital is, just so we can check whether we've got it or not.
It's a combination of physical and social attractiveness, which is becoming much more important in the 21st century. One way of describing it is this hypersexualized culture, but that's not what it's about. Film stars make more money because they're attractive, as well as hopefully having some acting skills. But the key point is that in Hollywood, male film stars are earning double at the top of the scale. They're earning double what the top female Hollywood stars.
Do you think that's to do with sexism, Catherine, rather than... Because obviously they're female stars, comrades may be just as good looking as them. Do you think that's an example of a pay gap, perhaps?
I don't. That is an example of men knowing how to exploit their erotic capital better than women. One of the most important books published recently is a book called Women Don't Ask. And my book on erotic capital is partly saying women need to learn how to negotiate, how to bargain. And the book on the new rules is also saying the same thing. In private life, but also in public life, in the workplace, women need to know how to ask, how to bargain, and how to negotiate. negotiate.
come in on that point about Hollywood? I mean, I was very struck watching the last Oscars, how much I long to see women represented in Hollywood, not just as the beautiful new young actress taking that Oscar. I want to see them winning the plaudits as directors, as editors, as writers as well. And I think that was a message that came over so strongly when I was researching my book Living Dolls, that young women want to be valued for their voices,
but
their
would
talents,
your Living
their
Dolls,
experience, as well as their looks.
Just because, to dig in just for one more point on erotic capital, would your Living Dolls, the women that you're writing about and criticising really this sort of sexualised world that you feel that they're now growing up in, using their erotic capital and being more in control of how they project that, would that be the answer for young women now?
I don't think that would be the full answer. I mean, I was also very struck when I talked to women who'd gone into sex work thinking that it was going to be something that they could control, you know, something that they'd sort of bought this idea that it could be empowering or liberating, and then really found that it wasn't, you know, that it was exploitative, that they found it very problematic. And I think we have to, you know, move away from this idea that women can be, you know, find their value in society purely through their sexual allure.
Let's hear a bit from a different society. Shireen, your new book, Sex and the Citadel, Intimate Life in a Changing Arab World, you put sex very much centre stage in that inquiry, and you bring out this paradox in which Islamic religion has never been as prudish as Christianity historically, and yet the wives of women are so heavily constrained today.
Yes, and what's interesting is that very often, as I said, the Islamist mystique, when men in particular try to impose these restrictions on women, they will argue traditional Islamic values. But the essence of Islam is not anti-sex. Islam recognizes the power of sex. What it tries to do is to channel it into certain arrangements to control that power. What is interesting in the long history of writing about sex in Islam is that women are seen as having much more powerful sex drives than men. And I think this goes some way to explaining the development and the power of the patriarchy, the desire to control women. And it's reflected in the long history of writing about impotence. You know, centuries and centuries of concerns about men being able to satisfy and therefore control women. And you see it today in the popularity of Viagra sales, which are very common in Egypt, a common wedding gift. The fear that men will not be able to perform on the wedding night. I just wanted to pick up 2 points that have come up in discussion, because you've been talking about the pay gap. And I think it's important to realize that for women in the Arab world, we actually have a work gap. Only 25% of women across the Arab region have jobs. And if they can't work for a variety of reasons, then that's a huge problem for them, and it reflects on their ability, their sexual rights, quite frankly, to negotiate within marriage. I met many women, for example, who were in unhappy, abusive marriages, sexually abusive as well, yet they were unable to leave. Although there is a provision in Egypt that allows women to unilaterally divorce, it's called khula, but they were not able to exercise it because they simply couldn't afford some of the financial ramifications of that. And just sort of going back,
that actually does take us back to Friedan's point, albeit in a context that you're now talking about in the Arab world today.
Because Betty Friedan also spoke about the importance of education for women. And what's very interesting, and the paradox in the Arab world, is that women are increasingly educated. We have very high literacy rates for women in most parts of the region, and in some places like United Arab Emirates, there are actually more women in university than men. And yet that is not translating into jobs. And so there is this real...
But it's not translating into active feminism either, is it?
No, I disagree with that, because this is picking up on Finn's point. The old structures, the old style women's rights groups have a real problem in the Arab world, because they are seen as disconnected from everyday lives of women. They are seen as also in hoc to state feminism. And so if you look at the Mubarak regime, for example, under the aegis of the First Lady, a number of laws were passed. For example, raising the age of marriage for men and women to 18, which are actually progressive for women's rights. And yet, because the regime was seen as in hoc to the West, and also autocratic and unrepresentative of people's interests, those laws didn't take hold. What's interesting is that there is now a new women's movement. Young women, a small number of groups like Nasaweya, which actually means feminism, by the way, in Arabic, a group in Lebanon, a group called Nazra in Egypt. These are small, sparky groups. And what's interesting is that they're not shying away from issues of sexuality as some of the mainstream groups are. And just to give you one example, the internet is now linking new women. So there is this website called Intifadat al-Mar'a, the Uprising of Arab Women, and it has over 100,000 people active on it. And they are tackling sexual issues, now not up front. I mean, there are limits. They're testing the waters. But on that site, I saw the other day a posting which says, "My hymen is not your business." That is radical statement. That is a radical statement for the Arab world.
Well, indeed, Finn, it would be unfair, I think, not to acknowledge that for some people feminism is associated with a certain sort of joylessness. Indeed, there's a very lively passage in Catherine's book when she says it's become defensive, joyless, and rails against feminist seminars for being depressing. You're an Anglo-Saxon feminist. No fun, no sex?
Well, I think, as Natasha said, we do need to address this myth that feminism is anti-sex. And when we use language, when we're talking about the so-called sexualised culture, what we're actually talking about is sexual objectification. Sex is not the problem. Indeed, it was one of the original 7 demands of the 1970s second wave women's liberation movement in this country, that a woman had a right to define and express and explore her own sexuality, a demand agreed in 1975. The feminist movement, has always been very radical. It was radical feminists in this country that pioneered the first lesbian communes, non-monogamy as a political act, the communal rearing of children, the deconstruction theoretically and practically of the nuclear family. These are radical people.
But you see, they sound to me more like political aims, in that a lot of them take a very critical view of the way that life is conventionally lived. So why are they particularly associated with feminism? I mean, a lot of feminists would simply say, I don't really acknowledge many of those things as goals or desirable things.
Well, I think that, as the saying goes, it's personal and political. The personal is political. And I think Catherine is right when she says that feminism needs to look at personal issues within the bedroom, within the home, not just in the workplace. But I think she's wrong, because I think feminism is doing that and has always done that. In Kate Millett's book, Sexual Politics, she said the biggest revolution will be cultural. The biggest revolution will be in the personal. It has to come from the changing in culture, the changing in attitudes. And I think young women are actually very motivated around these sexual issues. They're motivated against the narrow, mainstream versions of Western beauty, which, as Natasha says, they find constraining. They're rallying against how they're represented in the media, and actually they are not happy at being represented as nothing more than sexual objects in every billboard, in every magazine they see, and that is one of the most popular reasons for young women coming to feminism.
Catherine, isn't that a fair criticism really of the idea of erotic capitalism? It sounds great if you're in control of it, but there's a sort of flip side, and we've had it referred to in news stories in the last few weeks really, about the alleged preying on young women in the workplace and suggesting that they have to be kind of attractive and available to get on. Is erotic capital could lead you down that route, could it not?
I don't see why at all. What's happening is simply that for men as well as for women, being attractive, socially and physically attractive, is much more important today than it ever was in the past. And so men now are having women make passes at them. That never used to happen. Men are now finding that they need to invest in going to the gym and having a good body and keeping slim and dressing well in a way that they didn't used to before. And there is a more emphasis for film stars that they should be handsome and beautiful as well as being able to act, which again didn't used to happen in the past. You just needed to act. And if you were attractive, that was just a bonus. But now it's actually become almost essential to
I wonder if we judge the past rather differently there, because if you referred at the beginning of the programme to Mary Wollstonecraft, she talks about beauty as the woman's gilded cage and the expectation that women will be beautiful.
There has been a rise in eating disorders for men. Would you see that as a success? A rise in overtraining, a rise in steroid abuse for young men, trying to live up to this body ideal?
The things that affect a very tiny minority don't dispute the fact that there is a general trend, a social trend, whether you like it or not, there is a social trend that attractiveness is more important than in the past. And the reason is very simply, affluent societies can afford luxuries, and beauty is a luxury, whether for men or for women. We're all more visible than we ever were before. Digital photography and the internet have completely changed our society. And the third change is, again, an inevitable one in the labour market, which everybody wants to ignore. As we move away from manufacturing manual jobs to workforces that are almost entirely white-collar jobs and service sector jobs. In these jobs, social skills, charm, elegance, beauty, all of these things matter more because social relationships matter in the workplace, and people who can get on with people, make themselves liked, influence. They sell more products, they sell more policies.
So get out there and get the Botox and the boob job.
Well, men are investing in Botox and slimming and all the rest of it, and in gyms and all
mind
the
the
rest
men for a minute. Would you? So, for women to deploy their erotic capital, is the logical consequence of what you say that we should quickly be booking in our lunchtime?
What I say is that women should learn to exploit the erotic capital that they already have as successfully as men exploit their erotic capital. Men on average are earning plus 17% more if they're attractive. Women on average earn only 12% more if they're attractive, and there's a pay gap there.
I want to turn to men here, because it's true that men also feel pressure to look good and to play a role. And how far do we think the lives of men and women are the same these days when we share work and sometimes even cooking and childcare too? Or if there is a difference, is it still because of the gender stereotyping that feminists have talked about for many years, including Betty Friedan? Natasha, what do you think? Is there still a determinism about these gender roles?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the other issue that I look at in the book Living Dolls, the determinism that I think still encourages people to believe that women are just going to behave one way and men another, not because of socialisation or conditioning, but because of just the biological makeup, the genes and hormones that divide us. I think it's really important that we start talking about men here, because I think that was one of the gaps, wasn't it, in Betty Friedan's arguments, that she talked to women about how women should change and sort of seemed to forget about how, if we are really going to create a more equal society, how men do have to change as well.
It's quite funny, isn't it? Because she's always talking about women going back into the office. And
Absolutely.
you think, when Betty Draper goes back to the office, she's going to meet men like her husband.
Absolutely. Who's going to change? And who's going to bring up the children? Who's going to invest in family life? And, you know, my feeling is I was very inspired to write Living Dolls partly through the experience of having a daughter. I now have a son as well, and it's really interesting to me looking at how the gender stereotypes, I think, press as much on little boys as they do on little girls. I think that men also suffer in a very unequal society. They're often cut off from their more nurturing, empathetic sides. They often don't have as much of a choice as they'd like.
I think that's absolutely true in the context of the Arab world. I mean, certainly the pressures on women, the discrimination on women, whether it's enshrined in law or it's in the family and all aspects of life, is strong and should not be discounted. But people tend to forget that men are also under pressure in an authoritarian system. Mm-hmm. It's everywhere, and it actually drives men in many ways to behave certainly in undesirable ways, and certainly if we look at the outbreak of sexual harassment on the streets of Egypt, for example, there have been arguments made that this is not really about sexual frustration. There is conventional wisdom about that. But the reality, it's about frustration full stop, and it's about men who are under pressure in an authoritarian regime, economic, social, political, and they are lashing out at the next down the line in the patriarchy.
Do you accept that?
I think there's an element of truth to that, because my experience is when I was in Tahrir Square and there was a sense of purpose, when we were fighting the system, then men made way for us. We could walk. They helped us when the tear gas was coming. They were listening to us. I mean, that was a really empowering experience. Now, the challenge for Egypt and across the Arab region and the countries that are undergoing these uprisings is how do we take that moment of solidarity between men and women, but also between the classes, between the generations, and how do we transplant that into everyday work life, political life, and family life?
And that is often the story in revolutions, is when women will fight alongside the men side by side, and then how to ensure that men don't then sell women down the river when the revolution or the fervour of that revolution comes to its original end. But you have raised the P word, patriarchy, which I think, to quote from Friedan, is perhaps today's problem with no name. We don't talk about men often enough, either in how they are affected by patriarchy and how not all men are equal within patriarchy, but also that men are obviously and necessarily going to have to give up some of their power in order for us to move towards a more socially just world. We live in a male supremacist culture. We live in a patriarchy. If men don't like it, then enough men need to join together, change it, relinquish some of their power. And there is no notion that this is going to be easy. This is, of course, the longest revolution.
But I think, Finn, one of the key points in the Arab region is that we need to understand, what do men want? I mean, we don't have a great sense of what men want in family life in the Arab world. We only conceptualize them as part of the patriarchal problem. We don't see them yet as part of the solution because there aren't really the structures to engage them.
Finn, can I just dig a bit into what you want? I mean, you quite like the idea of some areas of separate activity and political separatism. Some people think this is a bit of a throwback, but you think it's useful now.
Well, I'm interested
Why?
that you use that word, because I've never applied that word. Separatism is a political practice, with a history, with a school of thought. It applies to a particular case. If you're talking about women-only political space and the right of all oppressed groups to political self-organisation, then yes, I do support that. And I also support mixed social movements, and indeed I'm involved in many mixed social movements. But women should have a right to join together in their own spaces.
Sure, but you used the term male supremacy, and some men listening might think it doesn't feel like that to me.
I wonder why. Would they like to look at the government where there's an almost 80% male parliament?
Is that the same as supremacy? I don't know.
Well,
but I mean, if you took the idea of sort of male supremacy and said you have to give up some things, then how would you want to make men aim to do that, want to do that? Doesn't sound like it might be in their interests.
Well, I think, as people have raised before, I think many men are unhappy with the pressures that they feel in society, living up to very stereotypical gendered ideals, the idea of what's been called hegemonic masculinity, or a very powerful normative example of masculinity in present culture, which most men actually cannot live up to. That is, of course, the definition of an ideal, but are then meant to feel ashamed and guilty when they cannot live up to it. I think men's shame and guilt, and as you said, Shireen, their desire to control and their fear of women's sexuality lead to, or is partly behind, some of the epidemic levels of male violence against women and children that we witness. And for that reason alone, all of us do need to work together to move towards this more socially just world.
Catherine?
But I think there's another factor, which is the elephant in the room that no one ever wants to really address, even if they're aware of it. The male sex deficit. I know in the Arab world there is this idea that if you don't practice female circumcision, women's sexual desire will be so unbounded they'll be copulating with every stranger that they meet on the street. But that's not the reality. If you look at all the sex surveys carried out around the world, male sexual interest vastly outweighs and exceeds female sexual interest. They're prepared to go spend more money on it, take higher risks for it, and place much more importance on it throughout their life. And in the past, marriage was always men's big trump card in the bargaining with women. And I would argue, and I've particularly looked at this point in the book, the new rules, which was looking at internet dating and bargaining in that context, that actually women's trump card is still sexuality, which because of
which, loosely speaking, in that book you're arguing for being able to take the odd away day from fidelity. I
was looking at a situation where there was bargaining, where marriage was not an issue. And in that context, women's big trump card is the fact that men want sex more than women do. And that's a very big argument. That is a trump card that no one wants to accept in the Anglo-Saxon world, but which is completely understood and accepted.
Because it's backward and regressive, Catherine.
It isn't backward any more than money is backward and regressive.
I find it rather worrying when we sort of, in these conversations, sometimes seem to be setting men against women, as though we're always kind of set against, as though our interests are always going to be against one another. That is not what I see day by day. Yes, there is inequality in our society, but I do feel that often, that men often are working with women towards a more equal society. And I think it is, what you were saying, Sheree, I think illustrates that, that because men do feel there is work to be done, I think, in getting to fairer shares in our society. Many men don't feel powerful and as though they are shutting women out. They want to be able to move to a more active role in their family lives.
And I think the key to that is going to be education. So certainly how we raise boys and girls and to interact with one another, not just in the classroom, but in the living room. I have a friend, I talk about her in the book, Azza, and her married life illuminated a lot of the problems in sexual life. But one of the key things about Azza is that she has 2 sons and a daughter. And in the home, they are treated as equals. They have the same chores, they have the same possibilities, and that's unusual, but that's key to changing attitudes between boys and girls, and therefore husbands and wives in the years to come.
Absolutely.
I would like to come back to the feminist movement, and a century after Emily Wilding Davison threw herself under the king's horse, women's lives, at least in the West, have improved dramatically, but has it all just succeeded a bit too well that a lot of women don't feel like rallying to the flag, or think the flag is a bit tattered? I mean, Finn, this is really one for you. You said earlier that campaigns are taking off. There's this new energy, and it's certainly true. There are new names in the public debate, new ideas. But for a lot of women, this has rather limited relevance. Why is that the case?
I don't think it does, and I think if you speak to most women, including young women, I think they share feminist goals. I think they want to be able to be in control of their own lives, have a career if they wish, have a family if they wish, earn the sort of money they want to earn, and enjoy equal opportunities. And we have made so many gains that women enjoy today because of feminism, and we have to make sure that we hold on to the gains we've won, and indeed gain more for those women who come after us. And I, in fact, around me every day see young women inspired, engaged, politicised through the feminist movement and through that empowering spaces that feminism can provide to young women.
Catherine, you call yourself a feminist, but you seem to take a bit of a different line between what Finn's just said and some of the ideas that Natasha has brought up. And do you feel that we're in a time of a backlash against an old-style feminism?
The most visible voice of feminism today is radical feminism, which in my view is just a politically correct, polite term for victim feminism. I think those women who have a grudge for whatever reason in their private life, in their family life, are attracted to it. But the vast majority do feel that they've got a situation where they have choices, where they have opportunities in the labour market, where they in many women actually are aware that they have more choices than men today, and those women are not going to be attracted to radical feminism because its emphasis on women as being the victims all the time of society, of men, of whatever. And women don't see themselves as victims. They see themselves as having choices and the ability to live their lives in just the same way as men. The problem that still arises is, as I've argued in both of my books, that women in private life are not very good at negotiating. And if you're no good at negotiating and bargaining and getting a fair deal on arrangements in your private life, you're certainly not going to be very good at negotiating with your employer for a pay rise or a promotion or whatever.
It is also possible, isn't it, Natasha, that there are gaps that have gone unfilled. Way back to Betty Friedan's book there, African-American women are notable by their absence. I know you've done, yes, for instance, a lot of work about women, refugee women, and where they fit into the model, or ethnic minorities. Could you just address that quickly?
Just very, very quickly, I'd like to say, I'm sure that if you had Betty Friedan on this programme 50 years ago, you would have said to her, Betty, you're only speaking to a minority of women. And you would have said the same to Emmeline Pankhurst 100 years ago. You said, Emmeline, aren't most women more interested in just getting the supper on the table? Do they really care about the vote? And I think this idea that feminism is just a minority pursuit has dogged feminists, down the ages. In fact, I think at the moment, feminism is speaking a very mainstream voice about inequality in the workplace, about, as you say, sexual harassment and sexual violence. A lot of young women joining in this debate on the internet.
But can I just ask, has it become a bit confused about ethnic minorities along the way?
Yes, it is important as well, of course, to work across the borders of culture and class, and often feminists have been very, very bad at this, and I think there's still a lot of work to be done on this. I think Shireen's book is really great, a really important book, because of the way that it opens up the lives and voices of Arab women. And we need, obviously, to work more closely across borders. And I think what you said, Shireen, about how feminism imposed from the top is never going to take root. We've got to be working at the grassroots across borders, woman to woman, through civil society, and otherwise it's just, we're never going to be able to spring forward. But I think there are some problems that we have to tackle across those borders of class, of culture, borders of countries. And yes, the women I work with, Women for Refugee Women, these are women who've had to cross borders, fleeing extreme violence, issues like trafficking, forced prostitution. And, they need the solidarity of women in other countries.
Sure.
I agree, absolutely. And I think the key, if we are looking at moving forward in the Arab region, and certainly it's very interesting that people, particularly women who are break the heterosexual mold. It's very interesting. Women who have sex with other women, some of the most effective groups in the region, are actually arguing, you know what, we need to look more broadly. So we need to look at what's happening in the wider world. Are there lessons for us to learn? But also, as we push our desire for rights and freedoms forward, we need to look at this in the much broader context of social justice and freedom and dignity, not just for us as women who have sex with other women, or not just for us as women. If we're not achieving this for everyone, how are we going to move forward?
Finn, these are very, very big goals which try to unite, the pay gap for someone working in a supermarket with what's going on the Arab street. Are you optimistic that feminism today can keep up with the rapid technological and geopolitical change? It's quite hard to keep abreast of all of that.
Well, it is, but I think the new communication technologies, social networking has made it a lot easier for activists of all political persuasions to network together. And we saw the role of, that in the Arab Spring, for example, the use of new communication technologies. And women here are communicating with feminists all over the world, and indeed making links and building bridges between all social justice movements.
Catherine, what would it take to bring you back into the mainstream family of feminism, or would you say no?
The thing that I thought was most important this year was the fact that the global attention in the media to the rape of a girl in India, and the reaction both globally about it and the reaction in India to changing the law immediately.
There we must leave it. Thank you to all my guests. Catherine Hakim, The New Rules is out in paperback from Finn Mackay. Natasha Walter has contributed to the forthcoming 50 Shades of Feminism. And Shireen El-Fekhi's Sex and the Citadel, Intimate Life in a Changing Arab World, is published this week. And Jane Garvey is here just after the 10 o'clock news with Women's Hour to continue this debate. So if you want to have your say about feminism, please call in on 03700 100 444.